much for doing this chat. I'm looking forward to kind of, catching up again, and I guess somewhat rehashing what we spoke about before, but it'd be nice to get it recorded and actually hear about what you've done and the book that you've written. So I guess it would be great to just kick off with you ha giving a brief introduction of who you are and what you do.
Oh, that's super. Yeah, it's been so long, but I've been investing money professionally. This year will be 32 years. It's sort of, I thought about that when the new year turned and I thought, wow, it's been 32 years. But, I also grew up with it. So when I was a little girl, my father had a stockbroker and we had to earn our allowance explaining to him how the markets worked. And investing was very important to him. And so it made, of course, this sort of unconscious, important impression on me. And I was still surprised when I graduated college that I went to go work at Merrill Lynch. I thought I was going to go to the Peace Corps. And so I was probably the only like stockbroker in training who was thinking that, gosh, stockbroker Peace Corps.
Why did you go and work as a stockbroker then? What was what was the reasoning behind that?
I think the most driving thing for me when I finished college, which was still early, and I had come with an anthropology degree and a political science degree, which are actually quite similar, looking sort of at how cultures divvy up power and resources. Markets also were similar. So even this not being very clear to me, I was honing in on this concept, but I think at that age, it was more competitive. I was getting jobs. I wanted to be independent. I thought maybe I would go to law school. It would be important that I paid for it. And, how could I earn money to do that? Um, and then when I sort of looked like a baby when I got the job. So I don't think they were very excited when I showed up to interview for it, because I didn't have sort of that stature to maybe ask people for to invest all of their money. But when I went through the training program and it was still very brutal, this was when things were not kind at all in the 90s, early 90s. I made it through this training program, which was cold calling, driving to people's homes, going to see people, asking them to, let Merrill Lynch hold all of their money. I was still so surprised how much pain money had for most people
Hmm.
and unexpected. So I was thinking sort of money was a wonderful thing. I'd grown up with a very positive perspective about it, that it was about freedom and it represented contribution. And, if you just found a way to help serve somebody else, you could get paid and, really influence your destiny. So that was very much my perspective. And then when I sat with people, I was surprised sort of being bombarded by all the different emotions that were at the table. There was defensiveness and shame and guilt and worry and even, disgust around it. And I thought, this is incredible. And then I started to get hooked a little bit because I thought, my goodness, I could really help people have a positive, more empowered relationship with money. And that if we could just look at it very simply, and follow some very simple principles, instead, it could turn into something that was fueling and empowering. So that was sort of the first, like I was hooked. And then Merrill Lynch in the early 90s, even though it was a rough culture, they still gave you a lot of leeway to say, what kind of business do you want to build? As long as you're following the rules and compliance and you're profitable, they relatively were going to give you a lot of reign to design your business or change your business. So I also loved that freedom. And so the first, I would say, 7 to 10 years went by pretty quickly. I worked huge hours. Most of my 20s were working big, big weeks building that business. But so I was surprised.
When you say building the business, like for people who don't know the wealth management business, can you talk about that? I mean, are you kind of working as an independent contractor, and is it down to you to essentially build a book of clients and make them profitable?
Essentially, yes. I mean, still the formal structure would more be like an in-house franchisee. So you're still a W-2 employee. You're still getting paid by the company. They give you sort of what the different dynamics would be to get paid. But in essence, you're also deciding how big your business is going to be or how much you're going to get paid. And, you have to be successful in your efforts, but no one would say to you, here's your salary or here's, how much money you could make. So depending how much energy and talent and all of that resource, you had a lot of autonomy. And still, I started in 92 when asset management was beginning. So the old kind of probably rough stockbroker movies or market movies were fading away, and it was turning into a profession. Much of that industry was getting cleaned up in a very big way, and it was important that stockbrokers were becoming financial planners, that they were getting certified and having all different kinds of designations. So you almost had that clash of different cultures. But really, still, what wove it together was an ethic of a strong work ethic, principles that were really based in freedom, and what I even kind of consider the American dream in the sense of you had a lot of autonomy and also ability to maintain the rewards of your labor with a good amount of integrity. And even I think, if people were being hired with less integrity or, you sort of had a mix of ethics, it wouldn't take too long for that to show up and really boomerang back. So I was surprised how much I fell in love with the business. I even became a corporate trainer for Merrill Lynch for many years, where I would go down to it. We had a headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey, and I would be one of like 40 people who would teach 5-year and under new financial advisors doing well. So
Mm.
yeah, I had sort of almost a romance where I really loved, to my great surprise, I fell in love with it in many ways. Still being naive, but it
Not interesting. And so how long were you at Merrill for?
I was at Merrill Lynch for 28 years, which is really
Wow.
really surprising. So I left in 2020 and I went to Raymond James, which I would say is sort of the Merrill Lynch of the 90s again. So it has more of that ethos that's very much financial advisor driven, very much client driven. And, during the big recession of 2008, all the big brokers were going down. And so Merrill Lynch had a forced marriage with Bank of America, which had probably had a forced marriage before with Countrywide, or maybe Countrywide was part of I can't remember, Bank of America at that time. So the culture didn't change very much for probably about 5 to 7 years. We still had a dominant client-driven culture, in my opinion. And and it was not an easy marriage because it's two very different cultures between the old school Merrill and Bank of America, which is sort of very centralized, top down. And 2016, 2017, you saw a very different culture coming in the door. And so I knew I was leaving, but it still took me a few years to actually really choose to leave. So.
Yeah. At what point then in this journey did you discover Bitcoin?
Literally 2009. So I was sitting in my dining room, yeah, just like using it as an office in Boston. And I was researching monetary reform and how to properly create money. And I don't even recall how I felt. I was on some forum. I couldn't even recall what forum it was. And they were talking about this thing called Bitcoin. And I ran into the white paper and I thought, wow, this is interesting. And so right then and there, I knew it was a game changer.
And just take a step back. Why were you researching monetary theory at that point? It's like a
So
random hobby.
and I really became obsessed with it, which is also somewhat fascinating because I didn't have a lot of peers, age-wise or socially or any of that kind of stuff. I'm not even sure that I would have known what monetary reform was in 2007. So I had been working on a master's degree at Tufts University, right outside of Boston, and sort of studying different types of economic systems, thinking how could we make markets stronger or represent more collaboration? And really, one of those kinds of things that you would see early on was entrepreneurs were not easily getting access to credit or small businesses that were being funded weren't necessarily representing projects that would really uplift humanity. So this might have been before the crowdfunding age, not that that has been as significant as it could be, as it will be over time. And maybe even then, sort of some I've forgotten even what it's called, the small business funding that, microfinancing was probably in vogue at that point. And so I had been studying different kinds of things, thinking, well, we're going to have a whole new system of collaboration that will still embrace markets and really give that freedom. And as I was writing my master's theory, my paper, I went back to the office and I started to notice that some very secure instruments that people would use to park money in for a down payment on a house or things that were AAA and had high liquidity were starting to move negatively in terms of price. And there was no market reason for it. So we didn't have any great movements in interest rates. There wasn't any really big concern that that was happening. And, it was eyebrow raising. So when fixed income has an inverse relationship to interest rates. And so things that are so liquid should keep the NAV or the share price of a dollar always. And when I started to see this, I thought, wow, that's strange. And I noticed it was happening. There was a reverberation happening in a lot of different fixed income instruments. And I asked a few people that I worked with or people who had been working in the business for 40 years, had sort of gone through the horrendous 70s of massive stagflation that had destroyed many people's careers. And no one had a great answer. I called the bond desk in New York at Merrill and I got big blow-offs, saying, oh, ridiculous, it's nothing. Um, and it was consistent enough. And I could feel it in my body. I was worried. And then also some strange things were happening. Either investment companies were starting to sell off pieces of themselves, or they weren't equally doing business with one another. I think at that time I also saw Merrill sell off the insurance, some arm of their insurance business. And I thought, wow, there's your highest revenue sector. They were bringing out more and more issues of preferred stock. So they were raising money in droves. And I thought to myself, my God, something's really, really, really wrong here. And so again, I continued to call down. Everybody told me, a liquidity problem is not a credit problem. And I would think to myself, so if we have more sellers than we have buyers, at some point, when does this start to become a credit problem? So I was in a phase of life where, again, I sort of had gone back to study, really more for fun. And I was going to start another master's at Boston University. And there was some pre-program where I could go to the Middle East and get a certificate of mediation from the UN, like with the Palestinian-Israel mediation thing. And I thought this would be fun. So I knew I was going to be gone for 3 weeks. And I poked around more and more and more. And I finally said to my business partner at that time, I really think we need to move people into cash because this thing is going to blow. And he had had a lot of experience and I have tremendous respect for him. And still, again, he sort of pushed me off until finally I started calling people and putting them into cash. And then he agreed. And we did this with the bulk of our clients. Soon after that, within about 2 months, the big credit crisis started to unleash. And so this would have been July. And by the time we got to December, it was wicked, so it was the December of 2007 and the market was selling off brutally, and the crisis had really begun in earnest. And it was breathtaking for me. It was really a life-changing event. It is what put me on this path. And I had sort of already been poking around for more fair systems or more systems where people had access based on meritocracy, how they could participate more. So it was the inkling. But when I saw what happened in 2008, um, it was so moving to me and breathtaking in the sense that many of the promises that were being made to us as advisors, or how the market was supposed to work, or certainly things we were saying to clients, they weren't necessarily true. Um, some preferreds were wiped out, some weren't. And I thought to myself, my goodness, you know, this is incredible. So I stopped at that point and I started to look what really, really, really caused 2008, the crisis. And it began this journey, which led to Bitcoin, which led to this extensive, more traveling and interviewing people and doing all this research to really examine how money had been created for the past 5 or 6 thousand years and what we could do as people, um, that would, have the good graces of our governments, but that what we really could drive as people. Um, and I was really left with the conclusion that money represented the people's wealth and contributions, and therefore people should be driving the monetary policy, and the government should be enforcing whatever needs to be enforced. And this is
What
sort of.
what do you mean by that? Can you describe how that would look in practice?
Yeah, I think that sort of when I really got back to some of the history of gold or some of the history of debt, that I probably believed at the beginning that, money started as gold or money started as these things. And I really found that that wasn't necessarily true. The anthropological record didn't show that. That even money was representing more of what people contributed to the group, or contributed to one another, and often was just kept score on a tally sheet. So in communities where people actually exchanged money with one another, it was more reputational. It was more, there was a sense of fairness in that people were not just taking without contributing, that people had each something wonderful to contribute one way or the other, and that if people could contribute, they couldn't be left out of a money system. And so I think one of the big sort of changing moments, that I saw, which was that gold coins actually were created by the state, not really by the markets. And that when kings wanted standing armies, men of 100,000, they didn't really know how they were going to take care of these standing armies. So they came up with this ingenious idea to create an income tax, or an annual tax that needed to be paid. And so that tax was created in scarce coins that were imprinted with the king's picture or something unique on it that would be difficult to counterfeit. And then they would say to the market people or the townspeople, you have to pay one of these a year, or you have to pay X amount of them a year. But they would issue these coins only to the soldiers, to the standing army. And so this would drive the market incentive for the markets to move next to the armies, to sell to them, to take care of them in order to earn these coins, in order to pay the tax. So all of this was created. The king didn't really need the revenue from the people, because the king could take whatever he needed as the king. And the people didn't really need to pay a tax, other than it was enforced by the military or the power of the king. But now, through this sort of implementation of creating a scarce coin to represent a tax that had to be paid, now standing armies were able to be sustained with very, very little effort. So it became a way to really manipulate behavior. And it wasn't actually coming as maybe Adam Smith or I grew up learning, thinking, gosh, people were trying to find a more effective way to barter at markets. And
So would you contend that people didn't need currency? They could have just carried on a barter system, or like a rye stone where you go in the public square and you just scratch on and say, this is, whoever own, like I owe you 2 hours of labor or whatever it is. Yeah.
That's how it appears it was done. So largely, the record, the sort of anthropological record, has these long lists of tallies, and it still had, I'm sure, some shortcomings to it because you would sort of also get a very tribal or feeling like if you maybe people weren't as free as they might be with coins, that they still had to be in the good graces of others, so you could get some other entrapments in that. And I think that this is sort of what Adam Smith and that movement was, to say, wow, could you have more freedom? But it also, I think, didn't come across as purely as it was intended. So yes, what the anthropological record shows is that actually, however it was deemed, and still there had to be some monetization of it. There had to be some value attributed to how we were calculating different values, but it was largely done on tally. And then even in communities where there were relationships, David Graeber, in his great book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, shows that again, the tallies were settled by either giving a little bit more or giving a little bit less, showing that we were all sort of in debt to one another in the fabric of society. And it also seems that only people who are not part of the society were paid in gold or were paid in sort of valuable commodities so that they would go away. You know,
Yeah, I was going to ask you that actually, because I was like, well, how would you do like international trade if you're having to have this tally system? So the tally system worked well for small communities that knew each other, and then external kind of strangers would get paid in something that more closely resembles what we know as money.
right. And it really sort of, especially, and David even will spell it out in the book, saying if they were scary, or they were dangerous, and you really wanted to make sure they were happy when they went away, that this was a way to do it. And then, of course, when people began to migrate and everything else, or really had to leave in a hurry, these other types of commodities were very important. But where money sort of at its essence was tied to reputation and tied to the essence sort of more on a philosophical value of this, from a beautiful perspective of what we do for and with one another. This whole concept of tallying, or like an IOU, is actually how money has been done forever and still continues to happen in communities, or certainly when depressions or big, large recessions set in. Those community currencies pop up very quickly again.
Yeah,
Um,
I seem to remember there was something similar happened in Ireland. What happened? They had some kind of a currency crisis, and they basically it's quite funny because when people talk about currency collapse and they're like, "Oh my God, what's going to happen?" And they very quickly, I think, like literally in a matter of days, started transacting based on IOUs. So it was just literally paper IOUs handed between each other about to kind of affect exchanges.
Because it really is just the promise to deliver. It's the same thing. Even if we look at the Federal Reserve notes today, where we're storing our money in banks or in investment houses, as we know, which still the vast majority of the population doesn't question enough. We believe that that store of value is legitimate. The culture believes it's legitimate, but it's very short.
So I just laugh because I always love that quote, the Federal Reserve is not federal and it has no reserves, which is true.
I know. I think I still even write in the book that it's as federal as Federal Express, right? You know, This is, and even throughout the history, throughout the United States history, when a bank for the United States was attempted to be created over and over, it still never really represented the people. It always represented a certain set of banking interests. And
Mm.
one of the things that really led me to the book was just the fascination of monetary history. And, on one level, to people, it could be upsetting, but I think on another level, it's so calming because it makes everything make sense.
Mm.
It's just not that complicated, and it makes a lot of sense. And oh boy, when it's sort of the same analogy. I think when laws are made that govern us far, far away from us, or when money is controlled far, far away from us, we have compensatingly less freedom and less ability to actually um, maintain the fruits of our labor. It's
Yeah. It's very interesting actually the impact that that has, and I think about that a lot with like all of this money that's being funneled to fund various different wars. And I don't think there are very many citizens of the countries whose governments are engaging in those wars that would actually personally disperse their own money to fund those actions. And yet it kind of gets done in their name because the government's able to print a currency that it forces the citizens to use. Well, I mean, if it was a free market for money, they could print all the currency that they would like, but it would be completely worthless to purchase anything with because people would just be like, oh, I'm not going to use that. That's not good money. It's being inflated. But because its usage is enforced, um, this stuff can be done in your name, and your own wealth can obviously be debased, but you have no control over it. I often think about that. I mean, somebody was saying, gosh, I'm trying to think if I get this analogy right now. They were talking about it was in reference to the Gaza and Israeli conflict, and they were saying, well, it's fine for the Israeli government to level Gaza because, Hamas were democratically elected, and therefore it's the Palestinians' fault that that attack occurred. Like they obviously supported it because they voted in that government. And I saw somebody respond and say, okay, so like by that rationale, then it's okay for the Iraqis to come and bomb us because we basically leveled or our government leveled their country and did what and sort of conflating the ruling party or the ruling class with the actual citizens. And it was a very fair point.
it's
Yeah.
it's it shows, I think it's amazing how money and dehumanization are so tied together.
Mm.
And even the concept of debt, and this is one of the things that I think I read David's book like 3 times. I had a wonderful opportunity to speak with him once at a conference in New York. And
David, what's his full book and his full name just for the listeners?
David Graeber, unfortunately, he passed away a couple years ago. He was
Oh.
really beautiful thinker. And I think his last book was like, I don't know, something like BS Jobs or just sort of how again, it's sort of this dehumanization of our labor, which, the more I looked into money, how sacred what we contribute in the most mundane ways to the most beautiful ways, and that even how we're storing that wealth that we've contributed in the type of money matters because it really represents the wealth and the effort and the sort of divine aspect of what we're contributing and from our parents and from our grandparents and our ancestors. And I think this even matters very much what people do, how the money is spent, and certainly how the money is invested. But he would point to a lot of even the IMF. When you would take the IMF with a lot of the third world countries, where this money didn't go to the people, it often went to bought off rulers, or oligarchs of those countries. And then the debt would double, would just compound at these super high rates. And the capital actually didn't go to build real new enterprise or infrastructure. So this
Mm.
is increasing. And there would sort of be the same, understanding that no matter what, the people had to continue to pay it back, even if it wasn't actually a just loan. And the IMF had no risk because they were still going to get the money back or get the resources really from backdoor imperialism one way or the other. And sort of all in the name of markets, but the complete contortion of markets. It's
Yeah,
it's
it's funny even if you think about it in a Western context, which is obviously a lot less like I know Alex Gladstein's covered as well that stuff in IMF ad infinitum, and when I've like listened to his podcast and read that stuff, it's just shocking. And he actually made a comment, in fairness to the employees at the IMF and World Bank, he said probably the majority of them don't actually realize they're just going back about their day-to-day jobs and they don't realize the impact of the the actions of the organization that they work for. But it's funny, I was thinking about this the other day and I thought, gosh, imagine if you just earned no money. Let's say you don't earn any money, but you have a house that you've bought. So you've worked for years, you've paid for that house. Well, at some point, that house is not yours anymore because if you don't actually earn any money, you can't pay your property taxes. You know, there are like all of these ongoing costs that are just have nothing to do with services that you receive and everything just to do with this insane system where it's kind of like your property is not actually yours. Um, and I find that fascinating. I mean, imagine if you don't have a job, but you maybe barter your time. So you say, I don't know, I'll walk your dog and I'll babysit your kids and I'll do whatever. And in exchange for that, farmer brings me a box of, vegetables every week or whatever it might be. But then the home that you live in eventually would get taken away from you because the government would be like, or the council would say, well, you haven't paid your property taxes, which, by the way, are insane. When you look at the cost of property taxes, the percentage is just insane. I'm like, you're basically renting the house that you've paid for. Um, yeah, it's
And
kind of nuts.
and the dislocation in insurance on top of it, other different kinds of things. It's absolutely true. I mean, I think again, this sort of goes back to it's the age-old battle of feudalism versus freedom. And, gold money, I think, sort of during the era of Adam Smith was sold as a freedom of the way out of it. And, Bitcoin is going to be a much more fair way and a much more legitimate way to do that. This is why I do think it's the first time in history that from a across the world basis, from a peer-to-peer basis, we have the opportunity for that. And I'm sure it will still get challenged in different kinds of ways. Where I can see I'm for the ETFs, the positive of the ETFs, but also how you could see a government try to say you can only hold it with a fiduciary rather than holding it yourself. And I do feel very strongly that people have to continue to hold it themselves and fight for that regardless. Um, but it's the age-old battle between a rentier economy, feudalism, and how important it is to have property rights. And that I also think privacy is very much akin to that. And that's one of the way, even if it sounds conspiratorial, I think a lot of the things that have been, growing in the culture are against privacy and all of these other kinds of things, part of which is fun. But the other part, when you really start to see how dangerous, when we lose all of our privacy, we very quickly lose our property rights at the same time. And when you create money out of mortgage debt, which is truly how 97% of Federal Reserve notes are created that come into our system, the inflation from the interest and also because that money is not being created commensurate to productivity.
Yeah.
And that's actually the really terrible inflation that we're getting. That's really the main contortion. And it's not that these governments don't create a horrible amount of money for either money laundering and all the maybe multiple side funding of wars. Maybe all the governments are funding both sides of these wars, because I do think that war is a direct output of creating money as consumer debt. I think that if we did not create money out of consumer debt, we would not have these wars. It just couldn't happen. And that's probably also why the Austrians want money to be a fixed amount and coming from gold, even though history has shown that then they diluted the gold, then we were off the gold standard because the desire for all of this looting for through wars has been so significant. Um, but I think that we have tremendous opportunity to make a change, and you can't do it without you cannot do it without proper money mechanics. But because we have the internet, we have blockchain, and people are willing, have more energy to look at some of these very painful, sobering realities in the world and say, maybe it's time for that to end. Um, I think we have tremendous opportunity in front of us.
Well, that's amazing. That's a very positive outlook. Can you talk then a little bit about how your book is structured, like the End of Scarcity? Like, how do you what's the journey that you're without obviously giving away too much about, about the content of the book?
No, it actually chronicles 7 years of my life, which could sound very boring, but it, it's actually fascinating. It's condensed into 1 year and it's written sort of in story form, so it's narrative nonfiction. And it really is the teaching of all of this money history and money mechanics, things that if we were born in the 30s or the 40s, we would have had a chance to learn in school. I'm convinced that even people in the 1900s knew this, and they would be heartbroken to know that their great grandchildren or their, don't know this anymore. So this is the foundation of what every person needs to know about money, and the history of money as to why there's so much unfairness in terms of even investments and business and all the contortions that come politically, socially, economically. And in a way, that's a big statement, but it all becomes very, very clear when we unpack the monetary mystery, when we start to say, wow, this is how money was meant to be created. This is what's happened. Now, even the political divisions, the social divisions, all of this starts to make sense. And it creates a foundation to be very, very empowered as I think in the next 10 years, we will be at the height of the battle to be able to create and maintain money properly, which guess what? It's been the battle for the past 5,000 years. And I think many incredible things, shocking things could come down the pike to try to change the way that we live, really reduce a lot of the freedom that we have, and coming through all different kinds of campaigns. And even Bitcoin, I mean, I'm rooting for ETF and all this other type of approval, but also still once in a while I wonder what is it that I don't know? How could the price have greater volatility? Could certain things happen to it? Um,
Why are you rooting for an ETF out of interest?
well, number one, I think that it's really important to sort of legitimize it through the systems that exist. And that may sound very antithetical to what's written in my book or to even some of the things that I'm saying. But when you get sort of this stamp of approval, you begin to wake up the masses. And I think you wake them up in a more gentle way than if a draconian central bank digital currency were to come out in 5 years or 10 years, and say, you know what? Um, there's no money for FDIC insurance. There's no money for Social Security, and climate change is on such a level that we have to have all this incredible scarcity in the physical world, and therefore everybody has to adhere to this, or we have such political instability, and even
They basically get their CBDC food stamps and they can go pick up their bugs from the store.
and we no longer have a Supreme Court, all these kinds of things. These are things that I have worried about for quite some time. And it for as much as I operate in the normie world, a big portion of the time, whether it's in talking to other advisors or operating with clients who just want to know they're fine. These are still things that make people profoundly uncomfortable that they need to be not only talking about, they need to be thinking about. So a Bitcoin ETF is, I think, something that a lot of people in my world don't want. You know, um, I would really suspect that a lot of people in traditional finance would, if they had a choice, they'd prefer to see Bitcoin fail. That would be my personal sense. Not just from people laughing at me, when I've had the conversations at work or rolling their eyes, but just because I think it's sort of when you have this dominion over the world and now something significant changes, it's very unsettling, and it's unsettling in a way that may not even be fully conscious. And I still think that there'll be quick adoption in terms of it being a significantly separate asset class, an opportunity. And certainly if the advertising comes, there'll be great demand for it. And it'll be, sort of a quick flip over. There may be some stepping on the brakes and grinding of the teeth, but if it performs well, I think we might get a real about face and people will start saying, "Hey, what is this?" So I'm optimistic that way. I think it's important that it happens because in my opinion, it would be better if these people got on board. I don't think
Do
they
you not think though that a lot of the kind of FUD, like the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that has been proliferated over the last few years was intentional? So to me it almost feels as if like the powers that be, like the governing class, have intentionally sort of defamed Bitcoin, if you like, such that, when they're ready to bring out their custodial centralized product, then they can start putting out more positive messages about it. I mean, to me, it sort of feels like that.
Definitely. Oh, I think 100%. Even as a little girl, when I would watch CNBC with my father, I'd sit on the couch and, whether it was Warren Buffett or any big investor would come on and he would say to me, now you see what he says to do, make sure you do the opposite. Make sure you do the opposite. And I would say, okay, Dad, and
So,
so
so
I,
the inverse Kramer is real.
oh yeah, it was real. Yeah, it's just, some things are right. He's been a little too positive for the new year, right? I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think it's much worse, in Bitcoin. I think it's not even just market moving. I think it's really they're either buying time, trying to again claim dominion, who knows? But yes, because this is the first thing that fundamentally changes money like nothing before. So I often get an image in my mind like a big, sawed off tree, like a stake going through the solid castle moat door. This is what Bitcoin is to the financial industry. And I think it's really important. Um, so, and I just think unless something like this comes, um, you still get a lot of people who don't want to pay attention to it. Not that they're needed per se, but it's helpful. And also it opens, the creaky shut minds to say, you know what, money is a socially created contract. Is the form of money we're using today correct? And are even the volatility and the problems that you have in the markets, are they related to the type of dollar that we're using? You know,
Yeah.
you couldn't get rid of the Federal Reserve whole scale without having tremendous chaos. But are you willing to look at how they're totally interlinked? And I think this is the problem a lot where, whether you look in the banking industry or in the investment world or any of these type of worlds, you have the vast majority of really, really good people working in these institutions who are myopically focused on what they do and the busyness of their lives. And if it gets uncomfortable, maybe they aren't willing to look at some of these other things that, for whatever reason, have been exciting for me to look at.
Yeah, I think people don't like change and they don't like innovation. I mean, I worked in finance for 20 years, and the last 3 years of that I was in corporate innovation, and it became abundantly clear to me that the immune system of large corporations will not, especially financial corporations like a bank, will not allow innovation to happen. It just cannot happen because I think to your point, the system's very profitable. And frankly, when you can print money, like you don't really need to innovate and make your business more efficient. In fact, the more kind of inefficiencies there are, and the more compliance and the more red tape there is, as much as everybody in the organization will moan about it, it's a great moat for your business. If it's so difficult for a startup to get into the space because there's just all of this like nonsense going on and KYC and this and that and layer and it grows. It's like a beast that grows every year. The bureaucracy just keeps self-replicating. It just, it's completely antithetical to being able to innovate or do anything in a free space. I was thinking back to what you were saying as well, just about this kind of interplay between feudalism and freedom. And I can't help but wonder as well, like what innovations we haven't created and what amazing things we haven't done in society, because there has been this kind of tendency that just grows constantly towards feudalism. You sort of, democracy comes in, it kind of rectifies it a little bit, but not quite. And now you just carry on with this trajectory of feudalism. Do you have any thoughts about why you think there is this tendency towards feudalism? Like what drives it?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is sort of in the human DNA, in the sense of when we're feeling less resourced or when instability gets big enough, we want some sense of security, some sense of stability. And so, I mean, and obviously we can have instability in so many different kinds of ways. In the 50s, you had so much more stability probably in investing, just where you could actually buy something with a legitimate yield and maintain your purchasing power with utility stocks or things like this. And a lot of this is gone. So when we look at, or all the wars that have been here and all the different types of insecurities, so there still is that, is the pecking order of the things that we need to be happy. I've even forgotten the name of the.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, yeah.
It probably relates to that on some level in the sense of we need a baseline of stability. And this is one of the reasons why my book is called The End of Scarcity or The Dawn of the New Abundant World, in that baseline of the flow of abundance probably really does exist. That the physical world scarcity, I'm not so bought into. I actually think that we're living in a planet of plenty in all different kinds of ways, but that a lot of our instability and scarcity is either socially engineered or created. And that still could come from that level of consciousness, that we're sort of here. And so hierarchical structures have been sort of the norm to deal with that. You sort of know what the rules of the game are. You have maybe mafias inside of little mafias, and that's what all ruling parties are. And I would like to think that we're coming to the point now where something more empowering is possible. And that's why we have the internet, and that's why we have blockchain. There probably are many sources of free energy or different types of energy that we, don't know or have been paid to go away. Um,
Yeah.
all different kinds of ways to clean the water or clean the air or serve nature on this abundant planet. And so, but it does require a sort of a shift in consciousness. And I think that we have been wired for some hypervigilance or some, panic looking out there for what's the next problem coming. And we're even conditioned to wake up this way, that these type of systems and knowing, okay, if I vote for this person or I like that person, okay, they're going to go and fix it. And I can go and just take care of the basics of my nervous system. And I think then the wars and a lot of the instability that probably also gets created keeps sort of an elite class in place. And then
I don't like calling them elite. I would say a parasitic class, because elite implies that there's something better about them. And I always think of it as a parasitic class. I wonder actually whether, do you think it's just going to go down a bit of the spiritual rabbit hole here, but do you think it's a kind of, the intent is to prevent us from knowing what we really are?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure all of it. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I really do think, yes, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's highly parasitic because also their extraction of wealth or their extraction of money is not correlated to any type of contribution whatsoever, except possibly a negative contribution. you know? And um and so yes, I think also when we start to really, and this to me, where I've really been wanting to work with communities to help them create sort of access to their own credit to, even if someone, if they weren't able to buy their own Bitcoin, but they're able to, issue their own food or these kinds of things, to turn that into a very legitimate form of alternative currency that's either priced in Bitcoin or that has the medium of exchange. You now start to turn the lights on that, wait a minute, the money power per se actually lives only in us. And so I do think, and I think these are highly linked to money, and even maybe why money has been pushed off, even in, sort of even in biblical texts, saying the love of money is the root of all evil. Well, I would say then the love of contribution is actually the empowerment, and money is meant to represent that beautiful contribution that we make together. It doesn't have to be an individual. An individual can work for someone. It doesn't have to be that teeny tiny, but to really recognize, wow, humanity is unbelievably abundantly imaginative and creative and innovative. And when we start to come home to that, we get a greater spaciousness where even can begin to laugh at ourselves for how much we can be pulled by some of this instability. So I think it's highly related. I think it's one of the reasons why the past 3 years maybe have even been so tumultuous. And even as we look toward the World Economics Plan to end capitalism and usher in bug-eating happitalism by 2030, or if they've revved up their plan, is because quickly I think humanity begins to accelerate. It's Bitcoin represents so many different kinds of things. Not only does it have a way to actually create, ironically, through its scarcity. So, but because it can become a proper form of money that way, and as long as it never ever got inflated or
What?
diluted.
Yeah, it becomes a proper form of measurement. I think that's the thing. Is Jeff Booth made a statement to this effect recently, but he was talking about, if your measuring stick is constantly changing, then you have no reality, like you have no truth, rather, because the measuring stick is broken. So I think the scarcity is more about maintaining the measurement stick.
It's really beautiful because that's literally what spoils our current form of money more than anything, right? So I write in the book that money has three roles to play. Number one, it's a means by which we measure the exchanges. So if I'm buying a cup of coffee, I've previously given investment or consulting services, and it's stored, and now it's assisting me in measuring if it's a fair exchange that I feel comfortable with. Now, when I pay my electric bill, I may not have that much of a choice. But so it becomes a mode of measurement. It's a receipt for services given, and then it's a store of value. So it has those three core functions. But just as you're pointing to, if money cannot maintain stable value, then it becomes destroyed. And who becomes destroyed by that? Humanity, community, society. Because if we all don't have the same inch or the same centimeter or the same mile, we couldn't even possibly, or if we're not using the same plug, you can't standardize and
It's
have.
interesting, actually, when you talk about the cup of coffee and it's a receipt for services rendered. Because if you gave me investment advice and you said, right, okay, and I gave you a piece of paper that said, okay, you gave me an hour of your services, I owe you an hour of those services. What's actually happening when somebody goes and prints all these other IOUs is that all of a sudden now you gave me an hour of services, but I can't, or rather, yeah, you gave me an hour of services, but you now can't use the IOU that I gave you for an hour of services. It's maybe worth half an hour.
Right. It's really just it's parasitic because it's extractive, and it's removed from the sense of contribution, even the self-esteem of contribution. You know,
Mm.
and that incredible empowerment that actually we have dominion over, even if I'm in a funk and I'm feeling blue, if I get up and I do something for somebody else, how quickly my funk changes much quicker for, than in a number of other ways, because it actually shows, wow, you get the experience that we have value, not monetary value, but we have value to one another, which then is monetary value. And so it becomes the sacredness of money rather than the transaction of money. And, so this is just it that what's amazing when they print money like this, in essence, most of that money never ever comes into society. So the people, again, who are producing all the value don't really have access to that. The banks do, the investment banks do. They can get out and buy stocks and pump the markets up. The money can be money laundered through wars, and then it can be a backdoor pumping up of our industry. So I think someone was even saying, with all the money to Ukraine, the weapons were old. It's a way to actually go and pump up this economy and try to keep it, on the wheels. But are we that limited in imagination? Are there not all these other beautiful type of things that should be funded in a way that actually supports all humans? And so this is really when we start, I think when we start to have this, when the lights fully go on to say, wow, money has no value without us. Money has no meaning without being connected to that contributive portion. So even if we say there are 21 million Bitcoin, but they can be divided into all of the small Satoshis, the amount of Satoshis that we would be used would still be commensurate with the existing amount of productivity at the time, right?
Hmm.
So it creates this molding of stable value to say, gosh, more are being used because the people are more productive, less are being used because the people are less productive. So it puts humanity back into the ebb and flow of life, which the rest of the living creatures on this planet are living in, instead of this cancerous linear push, push, push that, my goodness, you mean the Federal Reserve notes that are dropping in value are only being created when someone goes to a bank and takes a commercial loan out, or a consumer loan out, a mortgage. And then that money only circulates when the person who sold the house spends the money. And then when the mortgage is paid back, that money is destroyed. So if everybody paid off their debt, we would have less and less money in society. And you would be not able to fund even more beautiful ideas because the money that we're using is totally extractive, and it completely supports the feudal lords of the rentier class who are creating it through consumer debt and completely disenfranchising those with new ideas or enterprising and entrepreneurial effort, or just any contribution in general.
Yeah.
It's
Wow. Well, I know you're speaking at Bitcoin Nashville, so I'm very excited to hear you deliver this at that. Just fascinating. I love that you've written this book. I love that, the way your mind works is so incredible, and it's such an interesting juxtaposition with your background in financial markets. So thank you so much again for taking the time. And I do hope we can meet in person one day and actually have coffee and chit chat. And could you just sign off by letting people know where they can find you, your website, your social media handles, and all the rest?
Thank you. Thank you. Such a pleasure. I could talk to you forever. Um, Best way to find me is just with my name, which is Kristen, which is Kristen. And then my last name is Ragusin, which is Ragusin. So my website is kristenragusin.com or the endofscarcity.com. And all of my social is just my name also. And the book is a fun read for anybody who wants to dive into it. And it's on Audible and, of course, Amazon and every major retailer. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Forward to Nashville and to more. So nice to spend time with you.